Good afternoon. In the name of the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University and the Armenian General Benevolent Union, I would like to welcome you all to AiW. This university, since its inception, has prioritized the importance of girls' education, starting off as a girl school, and it has housed the first institute to solely work on gender justice concerns since 1973. This year is our 50th anniversary. The Arab Institute for Women. And basically, this event, entitled Gender Equality and Technology and Women's Inclusion in the Digital World, is one of those many events that we will be organizing within the context of this year-long celebration. And this event is but a glimpse of what we at the Arab Institute for Women do every day to shed light on gender rights and the importance of upholding it. To tell you a bit about the Institute, AiW was founded to preserve AiW's legacy as a college for women. In fact, AiW is the first institute in the region to work at the intersection of academia and activism. Here at AiW, at the Arab Institute for Women, we act as an independent convener and we try to promote interdisciplinary education and research with a view to social change and policy change. We create and share knowledge on women and gender issues. We build partnerships and form strategic collaborations to address gender justice and violence against women in all its forms. We provide capacity building and continuing education programming that focuses on women and gender issues. We connect academics and practitioners, working to create a space for knowledge building, knowledge sharing, advocacy, and policy change. We also engage at the national, regional, and global level, and we engage in dialogues on women and gender issues to raise awareness and rally for action. We work to bring stakeholders together to advance these issues through shared discussions and shared agendas. We at AiW also strive to serve as a platform for our youth, especially our students, to develop and advance their feminist agendas in the making and to help them take action and claim their space and make their voices heard. This panel on technology and women's inclusion in the digital world is highly needed. In an age where social media has changed the world and has quickly and drastically altered social behaviors, social media is a central part of the everyday life of 1/3 of the world's population, where out of the 7.7 billion people in the world, 3.5 billion of them are online, and where 1 in 3 people in the world are using social media platforms. Internet users spend an average of 2 hours and 27 minutes per day on social media. Nigeria is the highest, I think, with 4 hours and so, although trends differ from country to country. Globally, in 2022, 62% of men were using the internet compared with 57% of women. The current gender gap in the digital sphere continues to expand in many developing countries, creating a specific need to support digital gender equality. Today, we will try to address questions like, what are the effects of digital spaces that are occupying so much of our time? How are new communication technologies impacting us, either negatively or positively, etc.? In a world where the digital space has infiltrated most aspects of our lives, and where the adoption of these technologies is changing how we find partners, how we access information from the news, how we organize to demand for political change, to mention a few, it becomes timely to deliberate on the digital era we are living in with stellar experts that we have here in this room. I will stop here and leave the floor now to a word from our partner, the Armenian General Benevolent Union in Lebanon, presented by its Executive Director, Aline Ghazalian. Over and above that, after that, we will ask our colleague, Dr. Gretchen King, who is Assistant Professor of Multimedia, Journalism and Communication at AiW, please to chair the first panel with the experts, and then we will ask Lina Jarbouz, Programs Manager at Seeds for Legal Initiatives, to chair the panel after it. Aline, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me and AGBU Lebanon great pleasure to once again partner with the Arab Institute for Women in marking this very important day, the International Women's Day. We are all brought here today because of a shared vision to raise awareness on issues related to women's rights in light of the digital world and to highlight women's achievements around the globe. More than ever, technology plays a significant role in how we live and we work. During the pandemic and throughout the recovery, there have been dramatic shifts in how we work, connect, and collaborate. This year's theme, Digital, Innovation and Technology for Gender Equality, highlights the importance of strengthening the ties between science, policy, and society, and shows the vital role that women play in accelerating progress towards a more sustainable future. Today's conference, like Miriam mentioned, will discuss women's lack of inclusion and freedom of speech in the digital world and gender-based violence in cyberspace. Panelists will also explore cases from the region and how the future of women in the digital world is envisioned in the Middle East, where growing inequalities are becoming increasingly evident in the context of digital skills and access to technologies. A special thanks to our collaborators and speakers, technologists, journalists, and gender equality activists who believe that the need for inclusive and transformative technology and digital education is crucial for a sustainable future. I want to take this opportunity to shed light on AGBU legacy of female empowerment. AGBU has a century-old commitment to the elevation of Armenian women in society. As early as 1917, AGBU women mobilized a multinational clothing drive on behalf of child survivors of the Armenian genocide of 1915. AGBU also opened women's shelters, orphanages, and trade schools, and took up the daunting task of rescuing abducted Armenian women from Turkish homes. By the 1940s, women served on the organization's central board of directors. Today, during the critical years of Armenia's independence, the early 1990s, saw Louise Manoukian-Simon as AGBU's 5th president. Today, more than 40% of AGBU chairs worldwide are women, and looking solely at our young professional leadership, this rate increases to 55%. And now, I would like to invite the moderator of the first panel and the panelists, and thanks a lot for the collaboration, and thank you for having you here today. Thank you.
We can invite the panelists to come up. So while they're getting settled in, I'll just say thank you very much for this invitation. I think it's great to talk about media specifically in this context, and do note that I teach classes here at LAU on media and gender, and we have students there who are either tuning in online or they're in the room, and I also teach media law and ethics, which Mohammed has spoken at before. And so this conversation is very close to what I'm teaching, what I'm researching, and I do think it's important that we think not only about inclusion, but we also think about exclusion. And I do appreciate that the history of the AGBU goes back to 1917, and we must recognize that media, even if we didn't have social media at the time, media was part of women's movements, part of the early organizing that we can call first wave feminism in this region that AGBU clearly was part of. And so media like newsletters and journals and printed pamphlets would be the kind of media we can think of that was crucial to the ability for the union to organize. So fast forward 2023, and we're still talking about the importance of media. So I'm going to turn to the panelists. We do have 3 speakers. The first bio I have on my list is Mohammed. So are you prepared to go first? Okay. So I'll introduce Mohammed. He is, Mohammed Najib is the executive director of the Beirut-based digital rights organization SMEX, the Middle East, North Africa's leading digital rights research and policy advocacy organization. His work includes local and regional advocacy campaigns, research on privacy, data protection, and freedom of expression. Also, Mohammed organizes Bread and Net, the first unconference in the MENA region that tackles topics related to technology and human rights. Acting as the advocacy director in SMEX, he leads and assists in various campaigns in the Arab countries, mainly around digital rights. He is also a trainer, a speaker, and a consultant for diverse NGOs and civil society groups in the Arab region. So please welcome Mohammed.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Looking forward to this panel. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about digital threats. It's going to be about Lebanon and the region. We mainly have a hotline and help desk that tackles all the threats that's happening online in the region. Not only specific on women, but I will talk a little bit about the details and we can talk about the gender angle. So basically, in terms of numbers, we have seen an increase for sure. In 2021, there was around 120 cases that we received. In 2022, we just saw the report. I was looking at it today. It's 300 cases. So we have more than basically 300% increase in terms of the threats and the reporting that's happening. The kind of threats that we are seeing online, there is hate speech, there's hacked account, there's also disinformation, misinformation, and there's of course sextortion and gender-based violence. Mostly, but not limited to, we have seen platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp, TikTok, Google, YouTube. We also received cases from different platforms. Facebook is number 1. There's like more than 52% cases reported on the platform of Facebook. In terms of trends and in terms of like who are the targets, there's a high rise in the threats against journalists. There is also political activists, LGBT, artists, and of course as well women. When it comes to gender, we have seen like there is a balance. It's 62%. Like what I'm saying here is only the reports that we are receiving, and we can try to analyze some of the numbers. We have 62% target male and 38% females. One of the things that our policy lead, Marianne Rahme, says, and I just want to say what she says, this could be due to the unequal access to the internet between male and female. So one of the things that happens in the region, not all the women have access to the internet. And that's one of the reasons we have seen like not a lot of females are reporting cases. There's also the fear of reporting incidents. So many women, they have the fear of reporting incidents. And especially in cases where there's sexual sextortion or sharing photos online, etc. The number of gender-based violence cases are on the rise in our region. And there's so many cases that are related to lack of legal accountability. And in some countries, there's no gender-based violence protection of females. One of the issues as well that we are witnessing is tech companies. They have very slow response when it comes to help desk and reporting cases. And also they are not really getting the kind of threats that exist in our region. Like all the tech companies that exist that are, like basically all of us are using platforms that are based and born in the US, and they don't really care about the audience here. So mainly their automation, the AI, the kind of protection that they try to provide is mainly to Europe and the US. And unfortunately, people here in the region, including women, they are kind of like a second thought to these tech companies. I'm gonna stop here and we can talk later about more details for questions.
Cool, thank you, Mohammed. I'm gonna turn to Habib. Habib Akiki is a MA graduate research assistant in media studies at AUB. Habib is also has a BA in journalism, communication, and digital media studies from Notre Dame University, graduated in 2020. He has worked as a reporter and radio host at VDL, which I think is South Lebanon as well, and Radio Lebanon, as well as press and information assistant at the delegation of the European Union to Lebanon. He currently holds the position of media officer and project coordinator at the Maharat NGO, based here in Beirut.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me. So until the presentation, the very short presentation comes and start, I wanted to start by saying that 80% of women in Lebanon, specifically during the pre and post parliamentary elections, reported that they have been subject to GBV in cyberspace. Maybe I won't go in too many details within the numbers and studies that Maharat has done with all its partners, and not to go into specific cases. However, this specific number is very essential to point out, and I think this is what Muhammad was saying as well, that GBV cases are rising. And since we're talking about gender-based violence within cyberspace, I'll try to give a short, intro definitions about gender-based violence in the cyberspace, to then take it into the Lebanese context, and then put some sort of what Maharat is trying to put as action plans in that context. Technically, as we all know, gender-based violence is any kind or form of harassment, threatening, or any abusive behavioral or language that is targeted to a specific population or a specific individual within the digital space. And when we talk about digital space, we're talking digital platforms, social media platforms, messaging apps, etc. Mainly, gender-based violence can be considered as cyber stalking, cyberbullying, harassment, sexual harassment, online sexual harassment, and any kind of abusive behavior that an individual, or maybe also a bot account, can target a specific a person or even a community. And as we can see here, technically based on the studies that Maharat did, GBV in cyberspace mainly target women and girls, female journalists, men, Syrian, Palestinian refugees, the LGBTQIA communities, and adding to them people with disabilities as well. It is important to consider that men are part of the gender-based violence cases in Lebanon. However, the most prominent cases that we at least report or we analyzed were with women candidates, women activists within the political field, also women working within the health sector, and female journalists in particular. As I was saying, that we can somehow differentiate the multiple forms of gender-based violence as cyberbullying, hate speech, harassment, also threats, and cyber stalking and bias against women. These are the prominent forms of GBV in cyberspace that we were able to monitor during the spread of COVID, during the spread of cholera, during the pre and post parliamentary elections, and now during the preparations of the municipal elections if it happens. Now, without going into many details with these numbers that represent part of the GBV on social media platforms in elections 2022, I wanted to say that mainly GBV targets female journalists and female activists in Lebanon, and as I started, that 80% of the sample that we worked with and trained with female journalists and female activists reported that they have been part or they have been subject of the GBV within the online spaces. However, 60% of them reported and claimed that they didn't have any legal or administrative mechanisms to report on such cases. Therefore, and I leave this as well maybe for later discussions, this gap and lack in the legal system in Lebanon puts a big challenge in front of female journalists and women in general to report on any kind and any form of gender-based violence locally at least. Adding to that, and maybe this is part of the solutions that might be put as Maharat Foundation, and because we work closely with the communities that I mentioned before, we were able to train migrant workers, also female journalists locally and within the MENA and North Africa region on gender safety, gender-based violence, and also digital security. This is also something very significant to point out because gender-based violence is not, let's say, a violent case or a spectrum that we should not report about or that doesn't have a specific system or mechanism to counter. And this is why I think every NGO or every organization working on a gender perspective should put plan actions into countering such violent acts. And I'll stop here and leaving everything for later on. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We're going to turn last to Ayman Nahma, who is the Executive Director of the Beirut-based Samir Kassir Foundation, the leading freedom of expression NGO in the Levant region. In this capacity, Ayman oversees the Foundation's monitoring, advocacy, research, and training activities. He is a visiting professor at the College of Europe and leading a course on new challenges for press freedom. From 2016 to 2017, he was also the executive director of the Global Forum for Media Development, a network of 200 media development and journalism assistance organizations. He previously served as a senior program officer for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, working on election observation, election reform, civil society involvement in public policy making, and a lecturer on the master's program at St. Joseph's University Faculty of Economics, teaching policy development and communications. Ayman holds a bachelor's degree in economics from St. Joseph's University in Beirut and a master's degree in international affairs from the Sciences Po in Paris. He is a member of the Friends of Europe European Young Leaders Program, MENA chapter, and the International Contact Group on Content and Jurisdiction at the Internet Jurisdiction Policy Network for 2019 to 2022. Welcome, Ayman.
Thank you very much. Thank you, AGBU, but also the Arab Institute for Women, and a very special tribute to Dr. Mona Khalaf. She's someone I met many years ago, and she contributed to my passion for public affairs, for equality issues. So wherever she is, thank you for all your service. I move actually here to be able to see the presentation. I don't know if I have anything to move to the next slide. Yes, the keyboard. Yes, excellent. Thank you. So I'll quickly start with an overview of the situation today globally. The part of the world that is in green or in yellow, which refer to countries where the situation is slightly better when it comes to media freedom, is shrinking. Reds, dark reds, and I call it orange instead of pink in order not to be misunderstood. These are countries that today are the big majority of the world, and the situation is not improving anywhere. Lebanon and the MENA region in particular are some of the regions where the decline in media freedom is extremely strong. Why is that? Even countries where the situation was improving, well, they are witnessing a democratic backslide. Tunisia is one example. Lebanon, which is a country where in public speeches, in songs and in poetry, we like to focus on our freedom. Well, this is also a country where people get killed, and if they get killed, they know full well that absolutely nobody in the judiciary or in the security service will do anything. But actually, they don't need to be killed to expect nothing. They can actually be part of a demonstration and be shot at, or be part of a demonstration and be beaten by a police officer or by a political party supporter. And they know exactly that absolutely nothing will happen. And then our ministers are surprised while we're declining in our press freedom ranking. Let's look at 2022. 58 journalists and media workers were killed worldwide in 2022. You see that Ukraine, Mexico are very difficult part of the world. Usually the Middle East was prominently featured as well, not in 2022, but it also shows that the intensity of fightings, let's say in Syria and Iraq, has decreased. But you see also the point for the assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh in Palestine. If we look at the broad statistics from 1992 to 2023, nearly 2,200 journalists and media workers were killed. Of course, we can, it's terrible to say, thank COVID for a decrease in 2020, 2021, but we see again in 2022 that we're back to some of the average numbers of previous years. If we look more specifically at female journalists or non-binary journalists who were killed in the course of their work from 1992 to 2023, we cannot filter this gender component unless we know that people were killed specifically for a motive. So, because the numbers here include media workers and journalists, people who were killed during the course of their work or assassinated. So all the numbers. However, we only have this filtering from the Committee to Protect Journalists for those who were targeted, assassinated. 106 journalists, women, female, non-binary, since 1992. As of the 1st of December 2022, 363 journalists were jailed worldwide. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iran, China, Burma, Myanmar, Russia being some of the worst places in the world for being a journalist. 67 out of 363. You see here that the proportion is much bigger than the one I showed you earlier, are female or non-binary in prison as of the 1st of December 2022. 64 journalists missing around the world today, including 3 women, including 1 in Iraq that has been missing since 2014. So this is the situation broadly today. What are the ongoing challenges? Let's zero in on Lebanon. Impunity, crimes against journalists, crimes against marginalized groups, crimes against human rights defenders, all forms of violations. Whatever happens in Lebanon is met with impunity, including violence against journalists. Violence on a daily basis, assassination, physical violence and torture, gender-based violence that might reach up to 2/3 of female journalists having known some form of harassment or gender-based violence in the course of their work. A politicized judiciary system where legal actions are being instrumentalized and used by the authorities specifically to target those who oppose them, rather than the victims having the right to go to the court and seek justice. And this is something that is today used in our community. We call it SLAP actions. SLAP actions being actions where the law is instrumentalized by those in power to silence their critiques. Lack of fair trials, criminalization of defamation. And this is a very important point where we're pushing for cases of defamation being civil cases instead of criminal cases. But having them as criminal cases mean that police officers, the prosecutors can all get involved, and we know that the more you add actors of law enforcement who have never been trained on gender considerations, you increase the layer of risk that victims can encounter. the legislation on misinformation in the region is being exactly used for the same reason as previously the laws against terrorism, which is to stifle free speech even further. So because the entire world is scared of misinformation and thinks that misinformation is today the top priority, and it is the top priority, very often governments in our region are legislating against disinformation, but the definition of disinformation changes to being whatever is said against the government or the rulers. Same thing applies to legislating on terrorism. In addition to the cases of blasphemy or lèse-majesté, you can not talk about the ruler, you cannot talk about the head of state, or you cannot talk about what is sacred. And you see, unfortunately, that what is sacred is an adjective that is more elastic than nylon or whatever you want to, especially in our region. In addition to the digital risks that my colleagues mentioned, hacking, malware, mass surveillance, identity theft, doxing, hate attacks, online harassment, sextortion, and specifically if you want to look at the victims of hate speech in Lebanon, you have three categories that are quite high up, as my colleagues mentioned. Being a woman, being a journalist, and being opposed to some powerful political parties. So if you happen to be the three together, you can imagine the pressure that these women journalists face. So how to deal with the situation? We're all calling for a holistic approach to safety. Today, in most journalism faculties, safety might be part of some courses, but there are no specific courses or classes dedicated over the course of the entire curriculum dedicated to safety. And we're not only talking about physical safety, we're talking about all these components of safety. So we're talking about physical safety. How to work in hostile environments. How to conduct situational analysis to know what type of stuff I need to have in my purse, what type of products I need to get with me. Is the country where I'm going, are some of the products available on the market? Can I access them without raising any, without facing further risks? Are the hotels well equipped? Is the government there enforcing some specific laws? Are militias ruling the ground? So situational analysis and how to conduct it is an essential part of journalist safety. Specifically, again, for women going to specific areas or to any part of the world, how to conduct situational analysis from a gender perspective is something essential that we all need to include in our courses. First aid, safety of the equipment, how to protect the equipment I need, including the cameras, the laptops I need. Specifically, again, if a person being a woman or non-binary or from any of the various denominations faces additional risks if their equipments get compromised. This should be context specific, and health considerations are an essential part of physical safety. In a country where there is a cholera outbreak, a malaria outbreak, or any other type of diseases, this should be part of the training that journalists go through before going on the ground. Digital, my colleagues mentioned it, personal digital hygiene, institutional digital hygiene, and how to strengthen the entire chain that is as weak as its weakest link. The legal element is extremely important. Are there protective legal provisions that guarantee journalist safety, and specifically here with a gender component or gender lens? Is strategic litigation part of our culture? Well, it's not. We're always almost begging journalists and telling them that we have the funds to support you. Don't wait for the minister or the president or their in-laws to actually sue you. If you face a physical attack, harassment, any type of crime, any type of infraction against your right, you go to the court and force them to defend themselves. Yes, maybe the courts will file the case and won't even look at it for many years, but let it be there with enough pressure. So we need to reverse this culture of litigation through specialized lawyers, and I can see at least two of them in the room, and I salute them for their role, as well as self-regulation. And when I talk about self-regulation, are mechanisms that take place inside the newsroom, inside news organizations, to set the standards that guarantee the safety and the well-being of all the people. And this is, again, missing from most of the media outlets we deal with in Lebanon. And finally, last but not least, psychological. Everybody talks about post-traumatic stress disorder, especially when we go to conflict zones or when we cover huge explosions and dramas and genocides. Well, specifically the people in the region, Lebanon as well, we need to talk about OTSD, as in ongoing traumatic stress disorder. If you just add everything, this is a new, this is a concept that is context-specific and requires context-specific responses. The economic pressure that we're all feeling, but that female journalists in particular are feeling even more. You know the situation of the salary gaps. You know the situation of what it means also to be a freelance journalist and have, in the current context, to sell your pictures, to sell your reports to international organizations that know that $50 sometimes is higher than your monthly salary. This leads to a situation of extreme psychological pressure, of self-esteem pressure that we need to address. The isolation that was exacerbated by COVID-19, and also the question of who am I? The question of who am I? Am I a journalist? Or I'm a person who happens to be a journalist, who happens to love car racing, and who happens also to like this type of music, and I also enjoy speaking in that language and reading these types of books. I'm this entire person. And whenever journalists, and even more so, female journalists are isolated in one of their identities, the pressure it can create for their personal well-being, for their safety, for the decisions they make, for the entire pressure that every single woman who is active in the workforce faces, and the dilemma of the social pressure related to the patriarchal norms of dealing with a family. Imagine what it is if, for example, you're a journalist going to cover right now a conflict in Ukraine, in Karabakh, or in any other area in the world. So this additional pressure, which has its impact on safety, on the economy, has also a tremendous impact on psychological well-being. So in every single one of these elements, we're trying through our trainings, but we're also trying by integrating new curricula to university courses related to journalist safety to make sure that we have the gender component everywhere. Give you one last example. Body armor, flak jackets, helmets. More than 95% are designed for the male body. Something as simple as that. We can train journalists on all these elements and get them ready for everything. But then, it's not only us who work in the journalism field who need to integrate this approach. We're talking here to industries, to AISO that set norms and things like that. If there is no societal understanding of the need to protect every single element of the society and every single element of the press corps, we cannot really complete our task. So it's a call for all of us to do the right thing, but also to be strong voices so that the other actors, the other stakeholders of this food chain of safety also do the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ayman. Before we turn to the floor for questions, we have, I'll ask a question of the audience while you think of how you want to use the next 13 minutes or so. So it's great to have this panel today on the eve of the coming International Women's Day, specifically because in the classes that I'm teaching, we're moving to case studies of media law and problems related to media law, but we're also moving to a new module in media and gender about the political economy of newsrooms and the political economy of technology like the internet. And the reason I bring this up is because Mohammed talked about tech companies, Habib talked about GBV on digital platforms, and Ayman gave many examples about how institutionalized sexism, like cultures of patriarchy, influence something even like the design of the equipment that's made for protecting journalists. I would also suggest that a lot of the practices that you mentioned in newsrooms or gaps around that are also similarly structured by patriarchy and capitalism. So my question to the panelists is to sort of think more about the macro and the forces of patriarchy and capitalism and how this intersect in the digital world, We know that there are researchers who are looking, for example, at algorithms and how algorithms can reproduce sexism in the online space. We know also that there are many women who are journalists, other marginalized groups, non-binary, queer people who are using the internet as a working space and finding it very difficult to work equitably on social media platforms. So most journalists also have social media accounts. But is it equitable if, as a woman or as a marginalized community, that you're being targeted in that workspace? So in terms of what could be potential solutions, Ayman, you had mentioned education, but both Mohammed and Habib had pointed to legislative gaps or regulatory gaps, legal gaps, and you did as well in your presentation. So in terms of addressing the macro through law, it might be something worth considering, given that all of you pointed to a gap in law. And those practices, whether it's policies that are at the level of Lebanon, or that need to go beyond Lebanon, because a lot of these platforms that we're talking about, as Mohammed pointed out, are owned by US companies, often monopolies. If you've got Facebook, WhatsApp, and Insta, that's one company. So who on the panel would like to take on thinking about the legislative gaps and what potential solutions are? Because all of you noted the gaps, but maybe we can just move it to solutions before we turn to the audience.
Thank you, Dr. King. When it comes to legislation gap, I mean, since I mentioned U.S. companies, I mean, all these tech companies, they are non-regulated, and this is something that you all need to know. Like all the platforms that we are using online, it's like wild, wild west. There's no regulations on these tech companies. And this is really bad, and this is affecting everyone around the globe, because it's US-based companies. But when it comes to, if we look at Europe, for example, we have the GDPR, we have more regulations, and there is some hope on that angle because they are putting these tech companies to action more and to protect more people online. But definitely it's not enough. I mean, if you want to look at the macro level, if you want to look at our region on the macro level, it's we can think about policies that exist in the US and policies that exist here. They can look similar, most of them translated to Arabic, not all of them. The problem comes in the practice of these policies, because most of the like when we talk about policies online, most of how these policies are being applied is through AI, artificial intelligence. So in our region, there's like more than 90% or even 95% of the cases that we report are being taken care of AI, like handled by AI. And this is a big issue because our region is not one unified country. There's so many languages, there's so many different values, there's so many cultural differences, there's so many different dialects. It's really diverse, and the AI definitely does not catch this. When it comes to human moderators as well, tech companies make a lot of mistakes. In one of the most recent reports that we've read, Meta works with a company, third-party company that is based in Morocco, to handle content from Egypt. And 90% of the results of, 90% of the decision of this company was wrong. And it's a Moroccan company trying to handle Egyptian dialect, which is funny as well. Like how much work they need to do is a lot, and we are very far from this when we talk about policies and practices of policies in our region.
Thank you for that.
I will try to continue and to go back even further from the legislative perspective, because one of the things that Muhammad mentioned was the lack of practices of these actual policies that maybe US companies put or somehow implement differently in each country. I'll try to give one simple example of how at least we're trying at Maharat to put some sort of action plan within these US companies. One of the things that us as having Metaverse as a trusted partner for Maharat was the lack of documentation of, for example, gender-based violence cases for female journalists specifically, which help somehow these US companies to counter such cases. One of the things that we try to do is to put one hotline that's connected directly to Meta for female journalists to report on cases on a daily basis every second for them, to say what happened with them and what might be the solutions that they might be implement. Unfortunately, I can say that there is still a lot of work to do specifically from the legal aspect. Even Ayman was mentioning this, because we don't have a specific legal mechanism to somehow protect, for example, female journalists when it comes to gender-based violent cases, if I want to take this case, or to somehow guide into what are the reporting mechanisms, then what are the solutions that should be put in place or on the floor, and to somehow detach the political aspect also from the legal system. This is a big challenge of its own. So I think maybe it is a question to look also from a local perspective, because each country has a specific, let's say, or needs a specific mechanism for any kind of violence against female journalists, any kind of violation against freedom of media or freedom of press, and towards better safety of journalists.
I'll try to answer on the macro, but I don't know if I talk about Lebanon, that's macro or micro. In the sense that also what happens in Lebanon in terms of the legislative process is not really very different than what happens in other countries in the region. Sometimes asking the current, previous parliaments, including the current one, to legislate on very important issues is something that scares me a lot. And please keep your hands off important pieces of legislation. If your past behavior is an indicator of your future behavior, don't legislate it. But I know this is not a very good answer. Until we have good legislation, there are essential things to take place inside news organizations, and my focus is on journalist safety. Training the staff. I give you an example, happened just last weekend. We decided to offer a hostile environment and first aid training by the same trainers who work with the New York Times and other big international organizations to the reporters and photographers of Télé-Liban and the National News Agency, because they're often forgotten. It was important for us to make sure that this was a contribution. Up to the last minute, we couldn't know if we can hold it or not, because the legal advisors of the government decided that this is a donation to the Lebanese government, which requires a Council of Ministers decision. And we had to, and finally we discovered that if we don't say that we're offering this, but that we're organizing it under the auspices or برعاية the Ministry of Information, it can fly. So we did it. But things like that are important, and it shows that, in fact, nobody inside Télé-Liban or National News Agency fought to have this training. We had to fight to get it done, because the culture of safety doesn't exist inside newsrooms. And it's exactly the same case with the private news organizations. Only a minority has, recommended or asked their staff to join these training, except, once again, the online alternative digital media platforms like Daraj or Megaphone, Naked Politics, and others, who are asking their staff, please go and get trained. And this is a training that usually costs between $2,000 to $6,000 if you want to pay for it directly. Which news organization has in its internal guidebooks any policy related to harassment? Is it part of their integrity policy? Does an integrity policy document even exist inside the news organizations? It's a survey to conduct. Equipment, again. Insurance. We are in a country where, for example, if a woman is expecting a child, a lot of insurance companies would not cover the tests or the actual birth if the husband is not part of the same insurance policy plan, group plan. This has to change. And it won't change if I ask for it. The employers who are paying the insurance companies have to do this, otherwise it won't work. Judges, what is the quality of their rulings in the absence of a clear legislation? And finally, again, impunity and rule of law. For example, in safety training, sometimes we ask women to have fake wedding rings and baby pictures if they go to dangerous zones. This is, in a way, confirming the patriarchy that Dr. King was mentioning. At the same time, it still creates empathy in several areas of the world, which contribute to keeping these women safer. Well, it can only be fixed if those who would only be empathetic if they see a wedding ring or a baby picture, well, they're thrown in jail. Because usually they're bad guys, and bad guys' place is in jail. So unless we also solve this impunity and rule of law crisis, we will perpetuate under the disguise of keeping women safe also the kind of pressure and social pressure that fundamentally undermines their role and therefore their safety.
Thank you very much for that. We are supposed to end at 6, but we're given 10 extra minutes to ask questions. Is that what I'm understanding?
No. So
We still end at 6, and there can be questions at the end.
No. You can take some questions now, and then if there are any burning ones, we keep them to the end because we have another.
I do know we have another panel. I'm trying to do the role of moderator, but I got a little thrown off there. So are there questions in the room for the panel, noting that we will also have time at the end where you can ask your questions over food? I asked it strategically like that, Miriam. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Monica. I wanted to ask you, Mr.
Ayman?
Yes. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the number of journalists killed, and the male journalists and female journalists. And do you also know what is the percentage of, you know what I mean? If there is less female journalists, then of course less will be killed. But what is the percentage of female
Per
journalists?
population?
Yeah. Thank you.
Unfortunately not, though. I don't have the number. I can look at what's very interesting, though, is looking at, if I take Lebanon as a tiny example, but it's also the same situation. A huge majority of young women in universities studying journalism, and a majority of women in the reporting positions. And then you move up the ladder, the leadership ladder, and women disappear from the leadership of most news organizations. In Lebanon, if I look at the traditional media sector, so radio, TV, and newspapers, there are only, I think, 2 women who are head of media organizations, Al-Nahar and Radio Orient. But given the situation, we need to acknowledge one is Tuwaini and one is Ahali. Al-Jadid, she's still technically not the top head, but she's also the daughter of. Whereas if we look at the situation, again, of the new media scene in Lebanon, so the online news organizations launched after 2011, well, the majority is led by women. So again, there is a generational shift that is happening in the traditional media sector in Lebanon and internationally. The lack of equality is still very, very strong.
Yeah, whenever we start this next section on feminist political economy, we'll be talking about how most media in the world are owned by men. And yeah, even though we have a large number of journalism students who are proportionately more women, it's not the case in the offices. So we have another question. Are there any more? Another one here. So let's take the last 2 questions, and then we can hear the answers across the panel. So we'll do this question and then over here as well in front of the camera at the same time before anybody answers, okay? Thank you very much.
Hello, Joelle. I wanted to ask what do you think about Reuters giving digital certificates in collaboration with Meetup for the moment being? Isn't it easier to get everyone into digital world, ladies and gentlemen? Thank you.
So one more question over here, and we'll hear it. Just in front of the camera.
What is the question?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you all for your discussions and presentations. It's a very easy question. I just want to ask if the numbers that were provided in the statistics are available anywhere and where can we find them?
So we'll pass it to our panelists and we'll make it down the table if you'd like to start.
So first, for sure, any kind of data or statistics are available and we can discuss it further maybe after the panel, either on the organization's website or also my fellows' organization's websites. I think this is a good question regarding Reuters giving, I think, certifications regarding digital certification, introduction to journalism. At least for me, I will turn back this question with two questions. Is Reuters in some way or another, specifically that I remembered now that we were reading a specific report that was done by a research center in Europe about certifications that are done from many organizations and many newspapers and traditional media outlets in Lebanon and in the region, giving journalist trainings. And the question was, and the survey somehow concluded that most of these, let's say, traditional media outlets lack the new digital somehow standards that should be given in the trainings. And I think also not just the trainings as from the curriculum, but also the culture of where this training is coming from and from whom. This is one thing to ask. I would also ask about, I would question at least, or to be the devil's advocate in asking that somehow the collaboration between Reuters and Meta in this specific area, and also like one of the questions that we were asking as journalists from Maharat and other organizations from our partners, for example, the news academy that I think An-Nahar was launching recently. So this is also a question to ask. It's a question to ask if the curriculums include, for example, the safety journalism standards and protocols and curriculum that should be included. So I think I'll leave to see what's the answers of my fellows.
So go to Mohammed.
Yeah, I mean, we can share some of the resources with the organizers.
Perfect. Ayman?
Yep, the numbers I gave are directly from the Committee to Protect Journalists, cpj.org, and the annual ranking from Reporters Sans Frontières, rsf.org, and then the numbers I mentioned about the hate speech victims are all available on skies.org, SKEYES. Thank you very much.
Great. So just a reminder, social media platforms are also equally owned by mostly men and mostly white men based in the US. And to pick up on what Mohammed said, that's why they're slow to respond and don't really care about complaints coming to this region. So until we change who owns social media or create our own platforms, then we will keep dealing with that. I do want to pick up on what Ayman was saying about the importance of safety in journalism. We are offering and developing a course with the Samir Kassir Foundation to present the first class in the Swana region to be offered in terms of journalism and safety. And so that will be a course as part of the curriculum offering for fall 2023. So any journalism students who are listening, please enroll in this course if you find it as important as Ayman finds it for journalists to learn safety. Journalism, known as one of the most dangerous professions in the world, depending on the country you're in. Please enroll in that course. So thank you for listening to this first panel. Stay tuned for the second panel, and we appreciate you listening.
Thank you for the announcement.
Yeah, you made it sound so interesting.
Um, Very happy to be moderating this panel with special guests. I'll start with Rachel Dorreet, who was appointed as the representative of UN Women in Lebanon in March 2019, joining the country team from UN Women's Regional Office in Cairo, where she served as UN Women Deputy Regional Director from mid-2018. Rachel has worked for UN Women for 11 years and on issues of peace and security for 16 years, including in Afghanistan, Rwanda, Yemen, Jordan, Egypt, and now in Lebanon. I'm going to be starting with Rachel, and I'm going to be saying, online violence against women in politics makes political careers unattractive. Can we have your thoughts on this? And what message would you give to women who are considering leaving public life?
Sure, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. This is the kickoff for me for International Women's Day, so glad to be here for it. Thanks for AGBU Lebanon and to the Arab Institute for hosting and letting us celebrate International Women's Day here. I spend a lot of time talking about women's rights and trying to justify why women's rights and gender equality matter for issues of peace, security, prosperity, and stability globally, but also in Lebanon, and why we need to collectively act now if we want to see some kind of positive change, why we need to act to address gender discrimination. And the issue that we're all talking about this year is digital technologies, and being older than the average person working on digital technologies, I'm going to talk about social media, because really it's the only part of digital technologies that I can profess to even vaguely understand. And so, as other speakers have alluded to, Miriam at the beginning, social media and digital technologies are this double-edged sword. They've opened a wealth of opportunities for women and for men, for the world, but at the same time they've created new forms and new spaces for discrimination, and particularly for gender discrimination and violence against women, and specifically cyberbullying. And when I speak about cyberbullying, whether it's in Lebanon or globally, and its impact on women, the audience meets me with a bit of skepticism and doubt, like, cyberbullying isn't really that big a deal. Why are we talking about cyberbullying? The only type of violence against women that counts is physical violence or sexual violence. And cyberbullying is something that women should be able to ignore. It's just sort of collateral damage on the internet. But the reality is, and I think the norm for most women and men that experience cyberbullying, is that it can be overwhelming. So to quote from a study conducted in the US in 2022, amongst adolescents who had experienced cyberbullying, they found amongst that cohort a significantly higher prevalence of depressive symptoms amongst them and suicidal thoughts. But what's also equally stark is that the gender differences were huge. They found that 41% of adolescent girls were reporting depressive symptoms, and 11% of adolescent girls were reporting suicidal thoughts, while only 25%, almost half, of men were saying the same, and only 6% of adolescent boys were saying they had suicidal thoughts, again, half. Which then reflects on, well, what is the gendered nature of cyberbullying? Why is it that women face it so much or feel the impact of it so much worse than men? And certainly it isn't because women are weaker or our constitutions aren't built to address or to internalize cyberbullying. So that's one part, the human and personal toll that cyberbullying has on women and girls, also men and boys, but also the impact then that human toll has on society. And this is something that we've been working on here in Lebanon with Maharat and with AiW, particularly the impact of cyberbullying on women's access to public spaces. So all of you will know that Lebanon lags massively behind both global averages and regional averages around women's political representation. We have 8 women out of 128 deputies, and we have 5.6% of municipal councilors who are women. And so we're often exploring what are the barriers to women's representation in elected office at that level, but also at the local level. And we know now that cyberbullying constitutes a very real barrier to women's engaging in the public space. And reflecting on this, I recently, about a year or so ago, met with a group of young women who were looking at engaging in university clubs, specifically in secular clubs. So they just started to join the secular clubs across the universities in Lebanon, and I started asking them, well, could this be a hop and a step towards a career in politics?
And they all said yes. And this resonates with often what I would hear when I meet with other young women, women in their 20s who are working in spaces that often serve as pipelines for women in politics. But then getting down to the nuts and bolts of what it would be to actually run for women for a political office in Lebanon, I often hear the same refrain. And it's the fear about what will happen when they step out of their comfort zone and they serve as candidates, and the reactions that they'll get from their peers, their friends, their family, and the public. And they don't talk about the fear of being criticized for their political platforms. They understand that that's sort of par for the course of being in politics. What they fear is at that age, being an adolescent or in your early to mid-20s, the criticism that they'll get for both how they look and their perceived sexual behavior. They fear the onslaught of being told that they're too thin or too fat, that they wear too much makeup or they wear too little makeup, that they're too pretty or not pretty enough to be in the space that they're in, and for comments around who they may or may not be spending their time with. And they talk about this happening to them at key moments of adulthood, when they're in their early 20s, trying to shape who they want to be and who they are, and often already dealing with all kinds of insecurities that you deal with as you're getting older, and then having to enter that public space and again not be criticized for their political beliefs, but be criticized for how they look by their peers and by the public, whether they're entering university politics, whether they're entering syndicates or other spaces. And many of them said that this is the fear that stops them even getting on the road to trying to be an elected office here in Lebanon, but also in other places, and encourages them to choose, like, quote unquote, more acceptable or safer places to be a woman in politics, largely in the private sphere. And unfortunately, they're not wrong to be fearful. In 2018, ourselves with AiW and also Maharat and others began tracking issues of cyberbullying against female candidates and journalists, and my colleague from Maharat talked about journalists earlier. And the results were staggering. The cyberbullying that female candidates faced on a regular basis was both overwhelming, the majority of all female candidates, and not the occasional comment, but just an onslaught of comments as they entered public space, also journalists, and was very different than the types and the amount of criticism that their male counterparts got. So it was both the intensity, but also the kinds of things that were said that were of a very personal nature and often violent and sexual. So in some of that findings, we have a report from 2002 that found that 87.5% of female candidates reported this kind of high level of cyberbullying, which mirrors the same findings that we had in the 2018 election. We've seen almost no difference in terms of the percentage of overall of female candidates reporting cyberbullying. And the same for prominent female journalists. We interviewed 8 of the most prominent female journalists who were covering the protests in 2019, and 8 prominent men. All 8 reported and were able to give multiple screen grabs of tens to hundreds of incidents of cyberbullying, again, often of a very personal and sexual nature, while only 4 out of the 8 men had had something similar. And in ending, I just wanted to give you a few of the examples of what was said. How much is he paying you for the night? Don't play the role of a prude woman with me. Yes, sinless woman, we know your history. Baby, we know you're not a nun. You used to sleep each night with an Arab prince or with an Lebanese politician. I think this country needs more sex to please all these unsatisfied and grumpy women. Your makeup is hideous. You should go on a diet. You are like a cow who wears eyeliner. So if this happens once or twice, it could potentially be shrugged off. But I mean, we can give you some of the links of the reports. But the scale and enormity of the abuse that women in Lebanon, but also globally, face when they enter public spaces is something that they have to reconcile with and be ready for. And it often ends up being a hindrance to their engagement in these spaces. And of course, we know the knock-on effects of having a dearth or a lack of women in the public space, because they return to safer places, and specifically the private realm. Thanks.
Thank you. And a follow-up question I would like to ask. Do you think that this problem can be solved if we have like a new law to counter the violence against women online, or is it would put more restrictions also on freedom of expression, because we have two rights to balance at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a legal expert around freedom of speech, so I can't comment too much on that. But I will say, although I also have a healthy skepticism of the impact of legislation in Lebanon, if we look at the passage of the sexual harassment law in 2020, I think we've seen about 120 cases being filed in courts. And of course now we have the judges' strike and not much moving, but you know, there is a value to legislation, there is a value to groups of women or men being able to come forward and leverage legislation to try to enhance accountability. So while it's a long-term goal, it's definitely something we should be focusing on. But I was thinking a little bit about what else can we do, and I think similar to the panelists before me, it's around how do we hold social media to account in different ways, and that's obviously an incredibly difficult thing to do. But also, how do we serve as allies to women who step out? There's often amongst the feminist movement this debate of we need the right women in politics. Well, that's true, we probably do. We need the right men in politics also. But we also need to be clear as a feminist movement or as allies to feminist movements that there are red lines you don't cross. So even if we don't like woman X for her politics and we think she's part of the Sulta or whatever it may be, if she's told that she should be raped when she enters public space, we can all agree that that shouldn't happen, and we can collectively come together and say that that was, you know, inappropriate and unacceptable language. And then something that, especially at universities, I often remind men is that the role they have to play in telling their peers that this kind of thing isn't funny. And that's actually something really hard to do. It's very easy to sit around in groups, and men and women, but I think the majority of these we know are men sitting around tweeting anonymously, you know, horrible things to women in public spaces and trying to laugh along and find it funny, even if you don't find it funny. But it takes a lot of courage to stand up to your peers and say, you know, that's not cool. And we need that to happen. We need men to start calling out men for unacceptable behavior.
Thank you. I'm going to be presenting our second guest. Muzan Hassan is an Egyptian feminist activist and human rights defender. She emerged as a powerful voice, raising attention to rampant sexual assaults on women during the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. Along with the organization she co-founded, Nazra for Feminist Studies, Hassan documented human rights violation during the uprising. Despite sanctions and judicial harassment, Hassan continues to raise women's voices in the Middle East and North Africa region. Muzan, in an article you published last year, you discussed how social media and other online tools are becoming a new public sphere for feminist activists. Can you please tell us more about this?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. And I think such a discussion is important while today is the opening of the Commission of Status of Women 67 session, and this is the issue, the digital rights and women's rights within the digital sphere. So I think contextualizing this discussion within different regions, especially the southern region and our region, is something so important, because most of the time the discussion are happening internationally and happening within these spaces, which most of the voices are what's so-called even within the women spheres, yani, or the most privileged women. Most of them are coming from states or well-known political parties and others, but the voices of the on-the-ground and grassroots movements are not there. So I think such a discussion on this issue within our region is one of the most important issues to contextualize our rights, thinking, and movements. And this is one of the things about, while we are entering in the International Women's Day, I'm always saying that I'm so proud and happy to be an Egyptian feminist, because being a feminist generally makes you understanding and analyze what's the multi-layered of certain issues. You can understand why all of these things happening, because it's mainly about patriarchy, how patriarchy has been affecting all the systems and the social systems in our world, and especially in our region, and contextualize all of these issues and decolonize some of the norms and understanding of certain issues is a feminist technique. So being tomorrow is the International Women's Day, but I'm always thinking that يعني raising the voices of the feminist discourses and feminist movement is something so important. In Egypt, this has been happening in our country in the last 12 years. Yani when the revolution happened, and it's not the space by any way to say that it's a good or bad thing, by any way, as someone who's so proud that I was part of this process, but something happened in this country in the last 12 years. New generations, new discourses, new people have been entering this public sphere generally, and يعني the social media and the digital spaces were part of these new tools people have been using. Our revolution within the Western media have been recognized as the Facebook revolution, which is so limited in understanding how people can mobilize and see changes in a country which has more than 100 million people. But it gives something about the new generation's tools of understanding the public sphere. I do think that one of the things that's why I'm so proud to be an Egyptian feminist, I think the Egyptian feminists, and especially the new and fresh generations in the last 12 years, were so smart in using different tools in mobilization. How the social media have been part of mobilizing and raising voices on issue which was a taboo, especially in a revolutionary time, like the gang rapes and mob sexual assaults happened in Egypt from 2012 until 2014 systematically by non-state actors. This was the space women and feminist groups have been using in order to highlight things and raise the voices of those people who are speaking about an issue which most of the people in this country, they were not able to even understand it or deal with it, because it lack all our nostalgia about what the revolution is. To have the space of the revolution has systematic sexual violence incidents. I think also the Egyptian feminists, and especially also the younger generation, have been grounding their mobilization using the tools of social media in issues like women in constitution and women in judiciary, which used to be these elite things. Yani generally, people think that feminists who are discussing and talking about constitutional rights or women in judiciary are those elite women who are not part of the grassroots movements. But I do think what happened in the 12 years in our country was something has been different in a way. In mobilization doesn't mean that things has been better. I'm talking about the process that the group of women and constitution, which was part of a coalition with different feminist groups in Egypt, but also has been mobilizing younger generation to talk about constitutional changes. The group which called the Manassa Haqqaha for the rights of women to be judges in Egypt, because our situation is different than you. We have low number of women in judiciary. We used to have certain sectors within the judiciary. Women are not part of it by any way. And this has been developed until we entered this time for Egypt, which we really had this closed public sphere. So the social media wasn't a tool for mobilization, it was the parallel public sphere for us and for different feminist groups and LGBTIQ groups. Because we didn't have public sphere, we had this system in Egypt which has been destroying any small or big or even imaginary mobilization has been happening. The new groups in the Egyptian feminist movements have been taking their ways through social media in 2018 by naming and shaming different most important political activists in Egypt who have been part of, who have been harassers, perpetrators, and other things. And in 2020, this new wave of feminist movements have been using the new public sphere to organize. And I know I talk too much, but this is one of the things I think what happened in 2020 in Egypt, to have these new groups. So the groups which were not began in 2011 and others, the newer generations in 2014, we had a new generation in 2020. It was part of this collective mobilizations and building using different tools. And we had different young groups, young as women who were 19 at this time, and led constructive discussion, narrative collection for survivors, and also naming and shaming different institutions like the American University in Cairo as example, because we found that one of the groups called Assault Police, they collected the different narratives from survivors against one man, and it led with their mobilization that a newly Anti-Sexual Harassment Act has been passed in at AUC, also so-called the Fairmont case. And this new public sphere has the same tools like the ordinary public sphere. We have been targeted, we have been defamed, we have been named as prostitutes, named as people who are against the national security, who are not really revolutionary, and we are trying to be destructive to any good thing in Egypt. I think understanding this system, from understanding that it is not utopia, it is part of the same patriarchal dynamics, may lead us to understand and discuss what kind of legal system we want, what kind of protection and holistic understanding, and even psychological and well-being, because it's not something easy to find. Being targeted by state actors is something so hard. Being targeted and being a feminist targeted by state and non-state actors is harder. But within social media, it is something that you don't know from where the target is coming. So it brings something in. It's not only about the ongoing traumatic experience, it's about the collective trauma we live with gender violence. Sorry for talking too much.
And maybe, as you said, also doing a war on social media is very hard because you are fighting rumors and there is nothing that you can effectively do. So it has a very psychological toll on the activists.
Sorry, and it gives men who are patriarchal men, it's not only about the sex thing, this imagination all the time, and what they give women all the time, that it's all in your head. You are not targeted, it's all in your head, you fake it. So it is really affecting, as someone has been targeted for years from different things. Sometimes you sit by yourself and think that maybe I'm faking it. Maybe it's not true because everyone's telling me that it's not true. So it's
it is what we call today gaslighting, which has been happening for years, but it's only today that we started giving a proper name so we can fight it. I'm gonna leave my question to you till the end, and I'm gonna move to Nay. Nay is a feminist writer. Nay Rai is a feminist writer and researcher and activist with an undergraduate degree in journalism, an MA in media and gender, and more than 10 years of experience working at the intersection between knowledge production, be it academic research or journalistic reporting, and gender advocacy programming. She is co-founder of Harass Tracker, a sexual harassment tracking platform in Beirut, and is currently serving as a researcher at the Arab Institute for Women. Yeah. Yes, and you're going to be telling us how the Harass Tracker is helping women in the absence of effective mechanisms of reporting.
Okay, so for a change, I'm not the killjoy tonight, so I'm going to be talking about the brighter side of social media and the digital world, basically. So I serve as a researcher at the Arab Institute for Women, but today here I'm here in my capacity as a co-founder of Harass Tracker, which is basically an online platform that enables anonymous reporting of sexual harassment in Lebanon. This is how the website looks like. So we're a feminist grassroots initiative initially with the bigger purpose of fighting against the normalization of sexual harassment in Lebanon, and to engage the multiple relevant stakeholders like the public transport unions, the restaurants, universities, anywhere basically, all the institutional spaces where harassment happens, in a process of collective accountability over the issue. So I just put this here because I found it interesting that we started in 2017 and this was our logo. The woman with like the frustrated hair, because this is how we started off. And in 2020 we changed our logo into something that's more concise and more like that knows what it's doing. So I felt like it's a good way to start. So we started out of frustration and discontent with the status quo around sexual harassment and sexual violence in Lebanon in general, and with the realization that we were facing a data desert on the issue, because there were no numbers on the issue. There still aren't any numbers on the issue, but 7 years ago, this was the issue as well. So we had three main purposes. First, to document the aggravatingly underreported sexual harassment in the country. Two, to produce evidence for advocacy claims and possible policy recommendations. And three, and most importantly, to push the issue of sexual harassment to the public sphere, to have more conversation on the local and national scale on what constitutes harassment, because back in the day, 6 or 7 years ago, TV presenters and show hosts who take the liberty of basically defining what sexual harassment is when they have a sexual harassment or sexual violence survivor on stage with them on air. So, and who has the authority to define it and what it is. And so over the years, we did several things. Mostly we conducted a qualitative research onto people's perceptions of what qualifies as sexual harassment. We worked with various institutions, I will show you in a bit, and businesses on sensitivity training, and we developed a network of legal support to step in and support survivors wishing to pursue their aggressors. We started this when the issue of Marwan Habib, if you remember who the person is, surfaced in 2019. So basically, we wanted to leverage the data to instigate concrete changes on several levels, be it practical, such as adding an extra lamppost on a poorly lit street, educational, like introducing a mandatory training on sexual harassment in schools and universities, or policy-related, such as enforcing the implementation of a safe reporting mechanism in every workplace. Factoid, in 2018, an organization worked on a study that looked at maybe over 100 private company, basically, a workplace, and it turns out that only 10% of the surveyed institutions had sexual harassment policies in place. And so, more urgently and more significantly, what we came up with was we wanted to create collective accountability around sexual harassment and support all the relevant stakeholders, because we know that the law on its own would not do anything, including all the institutional spaces where harassment occurs. So, for example, if there's a law in the country, but on campus in a university there are no policies whatsoever, the law serves nothing, basically. To instate reporting and accountability mechanisms. So since 2017, we identified several cases of harassment on the platform social media. We basically wanted to force face-to-face meetings with these businesses to force more systemic forms of change. So we used the internet or social media basically as a platform to shape institutions and businesses into action. This was what we started with. So the backyard is like this complex of bars and restaurants in Hazmiye, for whoever do not know what it is. We got a report from the security guard, the harassment complaint against the security guard at the backyard. We wanted to pressure the business, so we published it on our social media and we tagged them. And a couple hours later, we got an email from them asking us for intervention, asking us for a meeting. And this was not because we were like powerful feminists. It was because the interaction on social media, the post went viral and people were engaging on it. So we had a meeting with them, and after that meeting, we agreed on specific points, such as basically training their management on bystander detention trainings, and asking them basically to make visible and explicit that there is a form of complaint, a form of reporting that women who go there and experience sexual harassment can actually report to. It stands in 2019, and these are just select spaces. This is one of the issues where a woman went to shower at the Edisans resort, and she saw someone, like a hand with a camera, creep up the stall to take pictures of her. She followed them, but everybody, magically all the cameras on the Edisan premises were فجأة stopped working. So this is one of the issues where we got no response. We tagged them, but they did not respond. They did, however, bully the girl into silence and into basically retracting her testimony, which she didn't do basically. Radio Beirut in 2019. This is a bar in Mar Mikhael, and those of you who remember the incident, a person who used to work there was sexually assaulted on the premises by someone who also worked at Radio Beirut. She posted her testimony. We reposted with trying to ask them, trying to show them what they should do next to at least show some remorse and maybe make some reparations. They reached out after that, but then they ditched us right after. So we asked them to do certain things. They replied days or maybe a week later and said, "Oh, we are going to work with internationally accredited institutions," and they basically did nothing. Shortly after, we used to see that the business was much less in Radio Beirut, and this was our victory basically, because we didn't retract anything, but they didn't do anything either. So Malik Taou in 2019. This also did not do, this didn't go anywhere, but we got to a point where we became bolder, and the online space sort of gave that to us. We would basically take quotes from the complaints that we got on the website and basically showcase it the way we did here. So the guy who was staring at the customer of Malik Taou said, "بحقلي اطلع عليكي قد ما بدي انت ما بحقلك تقولي شيء, so I am entitled to look at you as much as I want and you don't have the right to say anything." This is Sagesse University. Most recently in November 2022, we received 2 complaints of 2 different students reporting the same guy basically. And then somebody sent us, actually the woman in question sent us a screenshot of her being paraded and her breasts being commented on a WhatsApp group of the students. Of actually the guy who harassed her is on that group as well. So this is her, and they were basically talking about how it was an elections issue. She was part of the secular club, and he was saying, "Oh, the secular girls don't wear bras. That's how secular girls do," etc. Of course, the administration of the university did not reach out. They what they did instead was they called in the girls, knowing, by the way, that these reports are anonymous, so nobody would know that these girls would report except us. And so the administration called in the girls and asked them to basically bully them into silence and shame them for taking it out of university campus. Also, the guy in question sent us. They basically sued us at the electronic crimes department. This didn't go anywhere, but he did try. We urged them, of course. What we do is we use our platforms to basically to extend our hand and say that we are willing to help out, we are willing to support, but they never take it. So not only did we use our social media as a platform to shame, but also as a platform for solidarity. So these are a couple of complaints from different people about the same guy in the same area. And then when we saw this type of engagement, we thought we need to write something about it and showcase it. So we wrote the caption saying that this guy is being reported heavily in so and so space, so basically watch out. We also use it as a launching pad to advocate for concrete changes to share data. Marwan Habib. This is a serial harasser basically. one of his victims saw him in a protest in 2019, and she identified him, and it turns out that tens of other women reported him assaulting or stalking or groping different women around very well-known young women hotspots like university campuses and cafes in Hamra. We put together a network of pro bono lawyers who were willing to, we called whoever wanted to pursue this legally to come forward, and our lawyers were ready to do the needed work, but then of course his network of people bullied the girls, and most of them basically ended up dropping out. Same goes for Yusuf Al-Jundi, who's a scuba diver, who's a scuba instructor, who would harass his clients while they're underwater. And this story was picked up by Megaphone. Of course, it went nowhere. But at least what we do is we for everybody who would ever say, oh, we didn't know so-and-so was a harasser, we didn't know so-and-so had a legacy of harassment or violence, we are there, our data is there to prove everybody wrong. Like, we collected data before, and even if it didn't get anywhere, we have it. Security forces, of course. These are 4 different complaints, 4 different spaces. If you're interested, I can send you this PowerPoint. I don't want to take a lot of time. We also used our space as a platform for education. So when we first started, a couple of months after we kicked off, we compiled recommendations for all the stakeholders. These are examples. So for the media, for the public transport union, for activists, for restaurants, and recently, a year ago, we compiled the data to have some sort of like numbers to go back to, so highlights from the map. 10%, for instance, 10% of the pins on the map in the past 4 years were pins that describe incidents in public transport. 5% point to public servants, so darak, policemen, security guards as perpetrators. And we also tried to leverage the platform as learning to serve as a learning space. As when we started, we tried as much as possible to pick up the frequently stated statements, basically around harassment, myths, basically such as sexual harassment is only present in particular cultures and in the poorest areas, or sexual harassment is only perpetrated by uneducated men and poor men, and these are the only people who basically harass women, and we try to debunk those. And we use as much as possible to, so we got this complaint at one point, and then we got it again as a message from social media that the guy, so someone harassed her, and then she spent half of the message saying how this guy is unstable and mentally ill, etc. So we used this space we have to basically debunk this myth as well and say that it has nothing to do with mental illness. It's a social ailment, basically. And I think I'm done.
Thank you, and thank you for showcasing a positive or a way to use social media in a positive way, in a way where we can protect women, defend women, and counter this, whether it's sexual harassment or gender-based violence in general. Which brings me to reflect all together on one question, which is, we all agree that civic spaces are shrinking, not only in Lebanon but across the globe, and that social media is being used as an alternative space where we can advocate, where we can mobilize for the issues that we care for, especially when it comes to women issues. On the other hand, we see the use of intimidation. Defamation is also used by powerful men to intimidate whether activists or women journalists trying to tackle these topics and trying to talk about harassment. So what do you think would be a good practice? Where should we start?
how this holistic approach can be initiated. I mean, we all know that it comes down to this patriarchal system. So working on laws and policies alone is not enough. Working on education also, as Rachel mentioned, and pushing young boys today to call on their friends' boys also to call on what's happening wrong in front of them is also not enough. So where do we start? What do you think is should be done, or what is the way forward?
I think it is, I think seeing the social media as the alternative public sphere, so it is important for us to see and understand how people are dealing with us in the public sphere, and don't expect that we will have better situation in the digital space. So generally women in public sphere, they're not accepted, without generalization, with all being politically correct and accepting the different norms, No, we are not accepted. There is something all the time telling us that it's not your space, and you have something missing to be there. It will be in the new public sphere, which is the digital, and it will be harder because you can post any comment without being in such a conference and someone can confront you so people can respond. So I think by understanding that it is a harder and can be most hostile, we can see what's happening. In addition to what always missing from our women in the south part of this world, and also women from our region, our narratives are missing. So people are not listening to what we really face, feel, and how we reflect on. And this binary between either we are victims and it is the worst thing ever, or this colonized, westernized process, like, wow, women are active on the social media, as if we don't exist in this world. So there is something in between this thing, that it is a public sphere in a region which has all the problems, which violence is normalized generally, which is patriarchal, and people are so proud to be patriarchal. One of my mentors once told me that the easiest thing to be a researcher on women's issues in this region, because people are speaking about their patriarchy, but the hardest mission to be an activist and try to change those people. So I think while understanding this, we can also see that it's not either or. The law is a process itself. The law could be grounded, so to be a process for advocacy, to be a process for, because sometimes talking about education and tell women that sexual harassment is not acceptable. So the first answer, what can I do if I face this? So it's not either or. Maybe we can eradicate something, but we will not win, we know.
I think harass tracker is a great example of what we can do, so I'll leave it to
I'm muting myself by mistake. I think it's the key to me, it's based on what we've been doing at Harass Tracker for years, and based on my feminist activism as an individual, I think that it's key to basically involve everyone. It is not the duty of the state to make a law, to design a law that could save women or help women or protect women. Everybody needs to be involved. And this argument that, oh, we don't have a law, Allah, we don't have a law, we can't do anything for you. Well, actually, it's very easy to use it, but at the same time, it's also easy. It's also an easy track to sideline and to like not see the real issue. Like for instance, I'm going to give an example.
when we first met the public transport unions, they, aside from saying, oh, there is no law, is this a crime? Like, this is not a law, there is not a law for this. They also said it was easy for them to dismiss it and to brush it off by saying, oh, these are the Syrian drivers. نحن as Lebanese, we can't track the Syrian drivers. And also, like, all of this implied that they feel that this is not their duty, and it's not on them. Same goes to universities. Same goes to, we worked on a study, and I forgot to include it here. It was a baseline study with over 60 bars and restaurants in Beirut. We finalized the findings on the 17th of October 2019, so hence explains the silence. And we got like startling quotes and startling findings. Like, there's one bar owner who said, oh, we don't allow underage girls here. And we said, but how is that related? No, because harassment only happens between underage girls and grown men. And it also, again, if this points to something, it points to the ease with which people tend to dismiss this issue. ما في قانون. No. The state doesn't criminalize this, so why should we? And I think everybody needs to realize that this is there needs to be a collective accountability process for everybody to be involved, and people need to understand that this hyper dependence on legal frameworks in a country like Lebanon does not work. Also, not only because laws in general in this country and accountability is missing and laws do not work, but also because if we don't go after perpetrators in spaces that endorse them, we don't really care about perpetrators as individuals per se. We care about the structures and the conditions that enable them, and that is silent about, that normalizes this. When we first started, we said we don't want to tackle the prevalence of sexual harassment. We know that other contexts have higher prevalences. What we want to tackle is the normalization of it as something that خلاص بتصير مش ده حاله. So that's it.
If anyone has a question.
Thank you very much for giving us so much information about this issue. But I'd like to simplify certain things. When I think of the word cyberbullying, I'd like to go back to the root, bullying. And then that bullying, I think, should be tackled way back in high school with kids, because bullying starts there at school and sometimes in homes. Some kids are bullied by their parents, so if that germ is not sort of eradicated, it's going to get more complicated and then become cyberbullying. So the issue is really bullying, and I know that kids really do suffer at school. Even in KG, they do suffer. So really the issue, the genesis, the problem is that word, bullying. And I think that should be tackled very, very sort of psychologically, to reach to those kids, discuss that even with a 5-year-old kid, and discuss that, because I do know that kids do suffer from that. So then if we've got this bullying, if the issue is discussed, then cyberbullying would get lesser and lesser. This is my point of view. So it goes back to education, it goes back to schools, and even in families. I mean, we do know that certain kids are bullied by their parents. Sometimes it's the mother, it's the father, and so on.
Yes, and it's not talking about the forms of violence that takes place at first at home.
I mean, there is something, the term bullying,
going to
for
the
cyberbullying.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, Angela. I want to start my question with Mrs. Nay, stating that your platform's main objective is to track harassers. And how is this platform providing accuracy? Because reports can be from anyone, and I believe they're anonymous. Yeah, that's my question.
Is that it?
Yeah.
So basically, we had a learning curve on this. At the beginning, when we first started, we wanted to not question narratives of women, because we know in a context like Lebanon, who would want to say, like, who would want to claim that they were harassed or assaulted by someone? Let me continue. Thanks. Who would want to say that? So who would want to expose themselves to this kind of this kind of backlash? And most people did not give any names. So most complaints had 0 names and were pretty detailed. But then again, at one point, somebody was named. And this guy was basically, the guy was named and the institution was named. And this is how we learned how to basically mediate, like not allow for the complaint to go online automatically, to have like some sort of like a filter, which is basically a team of people, developers of the team. And the way we learned this was the hard way, because I saw the name and I saw the organization, and I know both. So what we did was we went to the institution, to the head of that institution, and showed them the complaint and asked if that was, did this happen? And they explained to me the entire process. It did not happen. What happened is, yes, there was one complaint, but then there was a mechanism in place, and this guy was held accountable for so and so. So this is how we learned that we need to take this with a grain of salt, in a sense that, yes, we do believe survivors, but we need to have due diligence practices in place, in a sense that if as I said, most complaints have no names except names of either resorts or like places, cities. So yeah, it's a learning process anyway. So I can't guarantee that I can't guarantee that from now on moving forward there will be no mistakes. But what I would say is this: we are trying our best. There isn't any precedent in this country that would help us learn faster, but we're trying our best.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for this conversation. It's quite eye-opening, disappointing in some ways. But my question is, in the Western side of the world, you feel that people are being more and more accountable. And you mentioned that you started pretty well in 2017, and your symbol was, So, and you've progressed to a different symbol. Does that mean that things have progressed? Do you feel that we are moving forward and people being more accountable to what's going on? Because you do see in England or in the U.S. that people are finally being held accountable. I like to think that things are becoming more. Abusers are taking more steps to are not abusing because they're afraid that women's stories have been listened to and they've been accountable. So if you understand my question, but are we moving forward just other than the symbol? Are people being more held accountable? Although of course platforms are becoming more larger, we have more social media, but are we moving forward? It feels like maybe in Egypt are things maybe getting more accountable. And does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's really important to, for me personally, I think it's not either or by any way. And as someone who loved the social movement, especially the feminist movement in our region, especially in the last 12, 15 years, I think those small victories matter because initiatives like NICE initiative and others have been happening in this region. It brought this sexual violence, sexual harassment, violence against women to be something so public and so grounded. It's not by any way like before, as an old woman, we saw how in the beginning talking about sexual harassment, it was like everyone's, including feminist movements at this time, they didn't want to discuss. And now in Egypt, as example, everyone's speaking about it. Everyone is talking about it. It doesn't mean that, and also I think we need to deconstruct what's moving forward, what's accountability, how we can be happy, and what's different between, what's the contextualization here and there in different places. Yes, there is kind of accountability, but see how the Me Too movement leaders have been targeted in the US as example, and has been, and every one of those women has been really ashamed and targeted because they began this. Life is not fair, generally.
I would say yes and no. Thank you for the question, because it's like an ongoing issue that we think about. I think that on the level of the discourse, it has progressed in the sense that 10 years ago we couldn't see any discussion on this, and this is why one of our main purposes, us and many other groups, was to push this issue out in the open, and to be able to talk about it in public forum. But on the level of accountability per se, it hasn't progressed because so I don't know if you've been following social media the past 5 years in Lebanon. Every now and then somebody is shamed and named and shamed, but it never goes anywhere. So exactly because there are no reporting or accountability mechanisms anywhere. Even organizations and institutions that claim to be progressive, they don't have it. Like NGOs or organizations or cafes that claim to be leftist and open and progressive and cultured, etc. They don't know what to do in these cases. But I would say on the level of discourse, it progressed, because I could give an example of the students in Tripoli in a school in Tripoli 2 years ago. These are not students who, first, they're teenagers. Second, they're not necessarily in the center. They're not in Beirut. They're not necessarily exposed to everything that we talk about here, but they were able to pinpoint what's happened to them and say, this is sexual harassment. And we don't only condemn the teacher who did it, we also condemn the director of the school who's been protecting him. Of course, when the law came in, we didn't get any good outcome out of it, because the guy was found to have like an occupational misdemeanor or like a malpractice kind of charge, and not sexual harassment or anything that has to do with violating the space of these girls. But on the level of discourse, yes. On the level of actual practices of accountability, I'm afraid no.
And I think that talking about accountability, it's a whole, we have to tackle the whole system. There is no accountability on anything in this country. But I agree with Nay, 10 years ago, we had no law. In that 2020, the law was finally passed. I think one of the lawyers who worked on the many drafts to reach finally the law to succeed and pass, it was a huge milestone. We have something to start with. We have a legal document today to say this is a crime, this is not acceptable. While 10 years ago we didn't. But of course there's a lot to be done, and as Naid, the discourse, creating this narrative of having strong narrative is key to advance these issues and maybe reach accountability one day. We can continue the discussion over the break. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for the institute.